Hello my friends. Thank you so much for all the support that I've got over such a short space of time. And all the advice has been so exceptionally helpful. Which is why we're here. We're now going to compile all of the advice and tips that I've received when going through that first unit in order to make the second unit something so much better. The first tip we're going to look at is the mold lines. Yes, it was something I genuinely didn't consider, genuinely didn't notice, but now it has been brought to my attention, I cannot unsee it. It's going to be something I will attempt to sand down in future, but if that fails, I've also pulled out my old hobby knife set from long ago when I used to do stuff with foam. They're still nice and sharp, and they shall be excellent for scraping off any unwanted mold lines, I'm sure, so that's one other extra bit of kit. Another piece of advice given to me was regarding glue, specifically to not use the super glue. Now I can absolutely understand why this thing was a bit of a pain at times. It was suggested to me instead to use a plastic cement. So with a little bit of magic, there we go. This one was suggested by a lot of people, the Tamiya Extra Thin Cement. I've yet to try it myself, but I'm confident that it will be quite effective. I'm very much excited to try it. So thank you very much for the suggestion, everyone. Another thing as well I'm doing is an even smaller brush. Much better for those eyes and fine spots. Look at that teeny tiny brush head. Looking forward to trying this. It was also suggested regarding the eyes to try using a toothpick to paint them. I think that was an excellent idea. And if my little brush don't cut it, definitely going to try a toothpick idea. And another thing I was told by someone is that the Macragge blue that I have in the spray can is actually a slightly different blue from the Macragge blue in the pot here, which kind of blows my mind a little bit. That's false advertising. And the suggestion was for me to paint over it again with this Macragge blue, even if it's only lightly, so I think I'm going to start making that a habit now, I think. Another thing as well that was suggested only by a few people, but it was something I could not avoid thinking about as soon as it was brought to my attention. A tiny hobby drill to drill out the barrels of the weapon. What do you think, Merlin? Yes, my hope is with this, we can make the barrels much more interesting. So I always thought it odd that the barrels were not already hollowed out, but I guess they figured if the hobbyists were going to do it for them, why should GW have to do it? And some very fine drill bits in here. Very exciting. Now, we gotta talk about the damn transfer sheet decals. An actual nightmare. But thankfully, I had a few really helpful tips. Some of them were quite obvious in hindsight, but with these helpful tips, everything should be much easier. Tweezers, of course, to help me move and manipulate them. With this, my dexterity is boosted by a good plus 50, of course. And there was something else suggested by an awful lot of people. Microsol and microset. No idea how to use them yet, but apparently this will help the decals look like they were painted on. It will help with transferring them onto the model. So I'm very excited to see these things in action. Gonna spend a bit of time learning how to do it and then use it in the very next model. Ooh, exciting. It was also suggested that if all else fails, you could just cut a bit into the decals. Help you mold them into a better shape, especially on those curved pauldrons. A nightmare. And another point was regarding the bases, texturing the bases. Now that is definitely something I want to try. I have no idea how to do it at this time of recording, but I'm going to look into it very shortly and hopefully come up with some good ideas, good directions to go. I prefer simple bases because I like the idea that I can drop the mini down in any battlefield and it will be neutral enough to work anywhere, but I do agree some texture would make them look really cool, so I'm definitely going to look into that. So all in all, these are really great tips from everyone, and I'm super appreciative of all the tips and advice I get. Not just the ones gone, but the ones going forward. I'm looking forward to all of them. There was another thing that I did research on the internet just the other day, actually. The suggestion that you don't fully assemble a model before you paint it. For instance, if the arm is crossing in front of the chest and you can't paint the chest, just paint it first, and then attach the arm after the fact. And I thought to myself, that makes so much sense. So that is something I'm very seriously considering trying, depending on the model. And if I remember. We'll see. But probably the biggest point, the single biggest point, layering, texturing, shading, all these things. These are things I'm very, very eager to try in the upcoming unit. I certainly am not lacking for paints or anything, it was more lacking of knowledge. I deliberately went into the first unit completely blind, but this next unit, no, I'm doing my research first and foremost. I'm taking the advice of all the people from the previous unit, and I'm taking into consideration the research I find online, which is what we'll be getting into next as it happens. I've now been looking more into highlighting and shading and all that jazz. So after base coating and then doing the joints, I'm going to null oil all of the little crevasses. There wasn't any particular technique to it, it turns out. It's just best to do it sooner, get into all the nooks and crannies and really make it pop. So I'm glad that I know that's the best thing to do now. And regarding highlights, I looked at a few different systems, and the best one is by Heavy Metal, which makes sense. For the highlights of the Space Marine, they suggested first to do an equal mix of Macragge blue and Calgar blue. And that's a good thing to go around the edge. And then to go around the edge even finer with just Calgar blue. And then after that to go around the edges even finer with Fenrisian grey. And I can picture it in my head already. And looking in the pictures, it really was quite sublime, so I'm looking forward to trying that. And it turns out my guess of using Retributor Armor Gold was correct. This is the right gold to use for things like their eagles. But, however, to make it even better, you then highlight it with some Liberator Gold. Then you give it a wash with some Reikland Flesh Shade, and that actually does make a lot of sense in my mind, to give it that sort of dirty look. So, Retributor Armor Gold, and highlight it with Liberator, and then wash it with Reikland Flesh Shade. I'm excited to see how that looks. Another thing that was suggested are things like the joints and even the casing of the bolt gun, which I forgot in most of the previous unit. It has a black, outer case, if you would. Abaddon Black is good, but then it could benefit from a lovely highlight from Eshin Grey, followed by a finer highlight from Dawnstone. So that's something else I'm very much excited to try out. Picked up a couple other bits of information, but I think those will be the biggest ones that will help us out. And again, as a final note, thank you again everyone so much for your support, and hopefully for future support from future people who may watch this in future and then decide to like it and follow and or subscribe and whatnot. So thank you again so much all, and I'm looking forward to continuing this with you guys watching. So I'm very excited to get into the next model, so let's kick this pig.